Today, we're going to be looking at Philip. If you didn't guess that from the sermon title, do we know a lot about Philip? He's not one that gets talked a lot about. So we're going to learn a little bit about Philip today. There are 4 places where the list of the disciples is mentioned in the Bible. You have it in Matthew 10, Mark 3, Luke 6, and Acts 1. And in the 4 Bible lists, you have the 12 apostles. The 5th name on every list is Philip. And in all those lists, Philip is paired with Nathanael, also known as Bartholomew. So by simple inference, we can think that those two are friends. So we're going to start building a picture of what he is. Philip had a minor role compared to some of the other apostles like Peter and John that we hear a lot about. Yet he was one of those 12 apostles that Jesus ordained to learn of him and continue his work. He would leave the earth after he would leave the earthly scene. Now, we don't want to confuse the Philips. There are 3 Philips in the Bible. The first Philip, or one of the Philips, I should say, was Herod's brother. You may remember the story in the Bible about how John the Baptist reproved Herod for taking his brother's wife, and how John the Baptist was beheaded at the request of his wife. You can read about this in Mark 6. So that's the first Philip. The second Philip is one we're going to talk about today, who is one of the 12. And then the last Philip mentioned in the Bible is Philip the deacon, the man we meet in Acts 6, who was a deacon who became an evangelist and led the Ethiopian eunuch to Christ. Philip the apostle was not the same Philip. So 3 Philips, we're going to focus on the one who was one of the disciples today. It isn't until the Gospel of John, even though you have those first 3, you get to John, it's not until John that Philip actually becomes a living personality, and the book of John actually puts some flesh on the skeleton that has the name Philip. So today we're going to spend some time in the book of John, starting out in chapter 1, and we're going to start in verses 43 and 44. John 1, verses 43 and 44. The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. So this is the first bit of background that we actually get on Philip. It says he was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Since they were all God-fearing Jews, Philip probably grew up attending the same synagogues as Peter and Andrew. So we're starting to build some good biblical evidence that James, John, Peter, and Andrew, Philip, Nathanael, and Thomas were all fishermen from Galilee. They all were in the same circles, did stuff together. If you're not sure about that, you can look in John 21. After the resurrection, the apostles returned to Galilee, and Peter said, "I am going fishing." And that's in John 21, verse 3. And the others who were there all answered, "We are going with you also." And according to John 21, verse 2, the group included Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Canaan in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. The unnamed 2 disciples are most likely Philip and Andrew. So Philip is likely a professional fisherman, just like a good portion of the rest of the disciples. Philip is a Greek name. Does anyone have a clue what Philip actually means? Lover of horses. I personally like that one. I know there's a few other horse lovers in the crowd today. He must also have had a Jewish name because all 12 apostles were Jewish, but his Jewish name is never given. Greek civilization had spread through the Mediterranean after the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, and many people in the Middle East had adopted the Greek language, Greek culture, and Greek customs. They were known as Hellenists. Perhaps Philip came from a family of Hellenistic Jews. Custom would have dictated that they have a Hebrew name as well, but for whatever reason, he seems to have used his Greek name exclusively. We're not sure what the other one was. Maybe he liked Philip better. We'll have to wait and find out when we get to heaven and can ask those questions. Looking back in John chapter 1, verse 43 through 46, so we're going to reread 43 and 44 and go all the way to 46 now. We're going to actually dig into that call that Philip got. The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip, and he said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him who Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." It seems that as soon as Philip found the truth, he wanted to start sharing it with other people. And that's what we need to do. As soon as God touches us, we need to touch somebody else. As soon as God reaches us, we need to reach somebody else. And as soon as God saves us, we need to save somebody else. We learn the truth, we need to share it with others. Now, in this passage, we see that Nathanael has his doubts. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Philip doesn't try and argue with him or reason with him, but simply says, "Come and see." Such confidence and certainty is out of character for Philip, as we'll soon see. The next time we get a picture of Philip is in the Gospel of John with the feeding of the 5,000. This is recorded in John 6. We look at the story a little bit. We need to talk about Andrew, but we return sorry about that. So we're going to look at this story through Philip's eyes. We discover here that Philip was a natural man. He wasn't perfect. He had some problems. We gather that from reading in John 1, that Philip was a student of the Old Testament. We knew he interpreted its literature and believed in the Messiah. And we know that he immediately followed Jesus without hesitation, and he invited his friend Nathanael to come meet Jesus. So Philip was a man of faith, but as we discover in John 6, he's a man of weak faith. His personality begins to show through. John tells how Jesus was on a mountainside with his disciples when a huge crowd came looking for the great teacher or healer. So going to John chapter 6 now, starting in verse 1, reading through 7. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, with a great multitude following him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what Philip would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that everyone may have a little. If you were to keep reading, you would see that verse 10 says there's about 5,000 men in the crowd. You add in women and children, and that number could be double or triple. According to Matthew's account, Jesus had compassion on the multitude and healed their sick. Healing all the sick in a crowd that large was going to take a while. In fact, Matthew says evening was approaching. And if you paid attention in verse 5 of John 6, you'll notice that Jesus actually singled out Philip. Now you may think, why would Jesus single anybody out? I know I don't like being singled out. Why would Jesus do that? Verse 6 says Jesus wanted to test Philip. But why Philip? So if we start reading between the lines a little bit, it would seem that Philip was the administrator of the group. We know that Peter was the spokesman, Judas was the treasurer, and Philip likely was the administrator. He was the one in charge of the logistics. It would make sense that the God of order would have someone in charge of logistics, someone in charge of coordinating events and acquiring supplies. This job was certainly suited to Philip's personality. Whether officially or unofficially, he seems to be the one who was always concerned with protocol and organization. We get a sense he was that type of person that would sit in a meeting and say, I don't think we can do that. He was a facts and figures guy, by the book, a non-forward thinking type of individual. He was the kind who tends to be a corporate killjoy, pessimist, narrowly focused, and sometimes missing the big picture. He often obsessed with identifying reasons things can't be done rather than finding ways to do them. He was predisposed to be a cynic, sometimes a defeatist, rather than a visionary. Jesus was trying to teach Philip a lesson by asking him this question of if they had the supplies to feed them. He knew his personality. He knew what he was thinking. The interesting part was Philip had already seen Jesus work many miracles. Philip had already seen water turned into wine, a man's withered hand healed. He'd seen Jesus' power over nature, the power over demons, power over disease and death, power over blindness. So what should have been Philip's response? What should be our response? Lord, I know it can be done because nothing is impossible with you. Lord, what do you want me to do? But if you remember in verse 7, that's not what his response was. Philip's response in verse 7 of chapter 6 was 200 denarii worth of bread is not enough. Philip had already started counting the heads in the crowd, and he knew that they did not have enough food to feed all of those people. Instead of thinking, what a glorious occasion. Jesus is going to teach the crowd. What a tremendous opportunity for the Lord. All the pessimistic Philip could see was the impossibility of the situation. From our human perspective, Philip was absolutely right. He couldn't afford a snack for all these people. Philip was probably thinking, 1 denarius would buy 12 wheat biscuits. Barley is cheaper, but what about this? Or we could do that, but that still isn't enough. And he gets caught up in the analytics of the situation, the materialistic and earthbound mindset. Philip was obsessed with the mundane matters that was overwhelmed by the impossibility of the immediate problem. He knew too much arithmetic to be advantageous. The reality of the raw facts clouded his faith. He was obsessed with his predicament, and he was oblivious to the possibilities that lay in Jesus' power. What he should have said is, Lord, if you want to feed them, feed them. I'm just going to stand back and watch how you do it. I know you can do it, Lord. You made wine in Canaan. You fed your children manna in the wilderness. Do it. We will tell everyone to get in line, and you can make the food. Andrew had a better response than Philip. He brought what he had to Jesus. He brought a boy to Jesus who had 2 fish and a few crackers. And Jesus used them to do a great miracle. In that story, Philip missed a huge opportunity to exercise his faith. Moving ahead in the book of John to John chapter 12, we get another insight into Philip. So we're going to go to John chapter 12, verses 20 and 21 now. Now there were certain Greeks among those who came to worship at the feast. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Again, Philip is too timid. With this was another opportunity to step out in faith, and he missed it. This was the final Passover, during which Jesus would be sacrificed as the Lamb of God. These Greeks were very interested in Jesus. They didn't go directly to Jesus, but went to Philip. Maybe it was because of Philip's Greek name that they thought he was the best contact. Maybe they thought he would understand them better. We don't really know, but those Greeks went to Philip. It was not a difficult request, yet Philip doesn't know what to do. He had not learned the heart of Jesus. To his credit, he took them to Andrew. Andrew knew what to do. He took them to Jesus. Andrew was already bringing people to Jesus, as if it was the right thing to do. He'd take the blame later. We may safely assume that Jesus accepted the Greeks gladly. The last glimpse the Gospel of John gives us of Philip's was at the Last Supper, or the first communion service. It was the last night of Jesus' earthly ministry. He'd gather with his disciples in the upper room. It was the eve of Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion. The formal training of the 12 had officially come to an end, yet their faith was still pathetically weak. This was the same evening that they would sit around the table arguing about who was the greatest, rather than taking up the towel and basin and washing Jesus' feet. Many of the most important lessons he had taught them appeared to go unheeded. As Jesus said, they were foolish and slow of heart to believe. This was true of Philip in particular. Of all the foolish and heartbreaking statements that occasionally escaped the lips of the disciples, none was more disappointing than Philip's remark in the upper room. The 12 disciples were gathered in the upper room. Jesus' heart is heavy. He knew what lay ahead. His time with the disciples was at an end. They seemed to be ill prepared to carry the work forward when he was going to be leaving soon. And so we pick up the narrative in John chapter 14, verse 1. Reading now from John 14, 1 through 9. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And where I go, you know that the way you know. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going, and how can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on, you know him and have seen him. Show us the Father. Oh, excuse me. I stopped reading too soon. 8 and 9, Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and yet you would have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how could you say, show us the Father? So how could Philip say such a thing immediately on the heels of what Jesus told him? It's profoundly sad. Philip missed the point right there. What do you think had been going on for the past 2 or 3 years? How could Philip, of all people, who had recognized with such enthusiastic faith at the beginning, be making a request like this at the end? Where was his faith? You can almost hear the pain in Jesus' voice if we read verse 10 and 11. Do you not believe that I am the Father, and the Father in me? These words I speak to you. I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the work. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father in me, or else believe me for the sake of the works themselves. For 3 years, Philip had gazed into the very face of God, and it was still not clear to him. It was not clear that where Jesus was going was heaven, and that believing in Jesus was the way to get there. If we were to interview Philip for the role to which Jesus called him, we might say he's out. He doesn't fit the ideal picture. You can't make him one of the 12 most important people in the history of the world. But Jesus said, he's exactly what I'm looking for. My strength is made perfect in weakness. I'll make him into a great preacher. He'll be one of the founders of the church. I'll make him a ruler in the kingdom and give him an eternal reward in heaven. And I'll write his name on one of the 12 gates in the New Jerusalem. This gives each of us a great deal of hope. Thankfully, the Lord uses people like Philip, and lots of them. Tradition tells us that Philip was greatly used to spread the early church, and among the first apostles to suffer martyrdom. By most accounts, he was put to death by stoning at Heliopolis, 8 years after the martyrdom of James. Before his death, multitudes came to Christ by the preaching of Philip. In the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 27 through 29, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. Jesus chose Philip not because of what he was, but because of what he knew Philip could become. There are many people who are afraid to follow God's calling, but knowing that God will empower you to become whatever he asks, you can step out in faith. Remember, God's strength is made perfect in our weakness.